You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Supplemental, the Hotel Carlton Mailbag. Welcome to Mission Log Genealogy. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Ashley Thomas.
Each week on Gene-ology, we dive into the Roddenberry archives, surface with a morsel of Gene Roddenberry's early TV writing, and examine it for the morals, meanings, and messages that were the hallmark of his most famous creation, Star Trek.
Unless we don't do that.
Okay. I guess we could kick back, order a pizza. No, just let the van be the show this week. What the heck? Get crazy with it. All right. Not really. We had a plan for a supplemental this week, and then that plan got thrown off the tracks. We've got exciting reasons for doing a supplemental or two. Some cool stuff has arrived in the archives, and we are digesting it a bit and doing some plotting and scheming because it gives us the chance to cover some stuff that might not have been possible to cover, or at least cover fully and correctly. So, watch this space.
Earl will be back without any trivia in a moment, but first, here is how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, please leave us a review and rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. 5 stars, please. And please remember, your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. Like today?
Cue maniacal laughter. And here I am with no trivia. That's kind of awkward. I almost don't know what to do with myself. Let's just read some letters, shall we? From our email, we have a letter from Andrew Beal. I wanted to tell you how much I continue to enjoy Mission Log Genealogy. You all do an exceptional job. I've been watching Have Gun Will Travel episodes now because of the podcast, a series which I had never watched before you announced Gene-ology. I didn't grow up enjoying many westerns, but I do remember Paladin was one of my grandfather's favorites. I think even more than the other series that you have covered on Gene-ology, Have Gun Will Travel causes me to look at the original Star Trek in a new light. Combined with Have Gun Will Travel, I think that the episodes you did on the unproduced Sam Houston series revealed to me that Roddenberry's original conception of the starship captain, whether it was April, Pike, or Kirk, included many of the features of both the Sam Houston character and the Paladin character. They are all brave, liberal in their outlook, seeking to do the right thing. They're good in a fight, but they'd rather not be violent if they don't have to be. They are also smart and literate, and of course, they like the ladies. Paladin rides from town to town solving problems, just as our Star Trek heroes fly from planet to planet solving problems. It's not that they're exactly the same character, but I think there are common traits. For Star Trek, Roddenberry layers on top an additional aspect, which is the commander's responsibility for his crew, a burden that Paladin did not have. In addition to the captain character, the thought occurred to me after several of your episodes that the character Spock is, at least in the parlance of the 1960s, an Indian. He performs a role not too different from some supporting Indian characters in mid-century westerns, which would often feature almost exclusively white heroes except for one Indian hero in the mix. I think Gene Roddenberry took this general concept from westerns and grafted it onto Spock as the sole alien outsider amongst a bunch of humans, which is the analogy of a sole Indian ally among a group of white cowboys. A writer of that time would also, unfortunately or not, invent different magical qualities and special rituals for fictitious Native American cultures, just as writers of various TOS episodes could invent all sorts of qualities for Vulcans as convenient plot devices. In addition, Roddenberry seems to have latched onto or discovered in Have Gun Will Travel an affinity for stories about different cultures working together. The Hanging Cross episode of Have Gun Will Travel is perhaps the best example, but in other episodes as well, Roddenberry seems to delight in stories where Paladin is working with, not against, a member of some minority group, including the Armenian immigrants, and even enjoying their differences. Also, Roddenberry obviously didn't create the Hey Boy character, but he took advantage of the fact that Hey Boy existed to provide examples of cultural diversity, a precursor to Iddick, in an era when that was less common than today. Even Charlie Red Dog has a similar racial element, although the context is quite different. All that to say, even though Roddenberry called Star Trek Wagon Train to the Stars, he could as easily have called it Have Phaser Will Travel. Sorry for the long email. Thanks, and keep up the great work. Thank you for the long email, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about in there, but I do believe that he's onto something.
I hadn't previously considered, using the Western framework of Have Gun in the typical Westerns of the day that Gene wrote for, and to apply that to Star Trek, but that works really well, so thank you for that observation, Andrew. That was really cool.
Yeah, I think perhaps one of the strokes of genius that Gene had between the end of Have Gun and between starting to work on Star Trek was you could have just one conflicted character, or you could split him up into 2 or 3 guys, and instead of internal dialogue while he was wrestling with ethical decisions, you can have actual conversations, which makes a lot more sense than one guy sitting around talking to himself, or what was it in Alice? Suddenly, we just have the voiceover quoting poetry. Where did that come from?
Good question.
Yeah, internal poet voice. So now Paladin suffers not only from resting boon face, as we call it in the Discord. So he is suffering from resting boon face and internal poet voice. I think guy's been out in the sun just a little too long. What do you think?
Well, that idea that some folks have an inner monologue and some folks don't. Maybe Paladin does, but his is just a poet. He just recites poetry the whole time.
That might be really good for some people. I could see where for others it would be the definition of hell.
When I was in high school, one of my good friends, when we were tasked in our English class with writing a particular kind of poem, I think it was a Shakespearean sonnet of some sort, he wrote one called Poetry is Bad, because he hates poetry, and it was amazing.
But it was a poem.
It was a poem about how poetry is bad.
Make it make sense, but okay.
Yes. It was his way of tactfully objecting to the assignment, but also still doing the assignment.
Surely there's a point or two in that for him for original thinking.
Our teacher found it pretty amusing, actually. We all did. It was great.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Andrew. There will be more to think about there. I will be very interested, Andrew, to hear your thoughts once we get into the Lieutenant. Because just something to keep in the back of your head, and I don't want to color your impressions before we even get to the show. But if you see the Lieutenant as an intermediary step between all of Gene's work on Have Gun and then Gene's work on Star Trek, it might be that the Lieutenant is splitting the main character up into 2 people who can have a conversation, that being Lieutenant Rice and Captain Rambridge, which is Robert Vaughn's character. Now, there's an odd power dynamic there, because obviously the captain outranks the lieutenant, but it will be interesting to see if we get to that, and to see if we, or if Andrew, sees that as, okay, we didn't just jump from 1 guy to 3 guys. There was this step in between where it was 2 guys.
I'm looking forward to that. So thank you so much for sharing your comments with us, Andrew. That was awesome.
A note from the Discord for you to ponder.
Yeah, so from Dave via Discord. Which of the shows covered so far that we don't have a recording of do you wish to see? Ooh, Earl, how would you answer?
You know, just last week I was sitting here saying I wish we could see the Marquis of Donnybrook, but let me kind of tip my hand as to the interesting development that has caused us to kind of pad out with supplemental for a couple of weeks. I have gotten my hand on some Boots and Saddles episodes that do include one of the episodes written by Gene. The thing that's really interesting about that it wasn't an episode that was on my spreadsheet. Gene wrote 4 episodes of Boots and Saddles, as it turns out, not 3. So, like I said, stay tuned. This has kind of forced us to reshuffle the deck chairs a bit. You never know what is going to walk in the door.
I'm really excited to get to take a look at that and compare. But to answer Dave's question,
yes,
I think I have two answers.
Okay.
You know, obviously it never got made, but the Man from Texas stories that you and Norman covered early in the show, I thought those were super interesting. Being a native Tennessean by birth and growing up hearing a lot about Sam Houston, who is from Texas but also Tennessee. You know, he definitely came up in my 4th grade Tennessee history more than once. So I really enjoyed listening to what y'all had to say with that, because I forget, was that a script or a story treatment that you guys had?
Well, we had a series Bible that we covered in one episode, and then 2 full scripts, neither of which ever got made.
Yeah.
So you know, there was no recording there really to recover, but yeah, obviously would love to have seen that gotten made.
Yeah.
I find myself wondering who would have been cast as Sam Houston.
It's a good question. I don't know. But yeah, that's definitely one, you know, obviously we're not going to go find a recording of that because it never got made in the first place. But if we could have a recording of it, I would like that, please and thank you. Number 2, I would really love for somebody to unearth the Marquis of Donnybrook, just because I want to see DeForest Kelley.
Yeah, baby DeForest Kelley.
Baby DeForest Kelley. No whiskers, not looking grumpy, kind of like, you know, pleasantly grumpy like McCoy does sometimes.
He wasn't even DeForest yet. He was DeSapling.
I don't think he was DeSapling. He might have been DeTrees.
Yeah, DeShrubs.
DeShrubberies!
My answer on this really has not changed from earlier in the podcast. I would give various parts of my anatomy that are not being used for anything else right now to have the secret weapon of 117 suddenly turn up. First off, I think that would have huge historical import because it's Gene's first produced science fiction piece, but just the sheer amount of thought and a little bit of world building, and it's so slyly funny and romantic and just has that, you know, that twinkle in the eye that Gene was renowned for having at all times. If anything were to turn up, I think that would be the most historically significant thing that actually got made if a recording ever turned up of it. Because so much, you know, and Norm really blew my mind bringing up that these aliens were kind of proto-Vulcans in that story. So much of what Star Trek would become was there already, before Have Gun Will Travel, before any of the stuff we're covering now. It's just like a window in time opened up to Gene's future, and this story just tumbled back through it, and somehow made it on the air. So, yeah, my answer would be, you know, that some film collector somewhere has a mislabeled reel sitting around that someday somebody is going to open up and say, oh, what is the secret weapon of 117? I would love for that to happen. I would love to be around when it happens.
Yeah, so somebody get on that, please and thank you. I'd like to see that one, too.
It would be neato. I know in the UK there is a very organized movement to recover lost media. And the elephant in the room with that movement is that so much of it is focused on, let's find lost Doctor Who episodes. Oh, okay, big Doctor Who fan here. I'm all for it. But let's find other stuff that is missing and bring it back. And get it in front of the public, not just for weird little screenings somewhere, which the British Film Institute is renowned for doing. But sometimes it happens there and nowhere else, and you've got to go to that event and see it. But it would be great if there was that kind of organized thing happening in the U.S., because it really needs to be. And maybe there is, and I'm not aware of it, and someone can point me in that direction. Would be lovely to have conversations with those people. But I don't see anything in the U.S. that compares to the events that happen in the U.K., such as, Missing Believed Wiped, which is where they actually do public screenings of stuff that has been found and come to light. It would be super neat to see it that organized on this side of the Atlantic. But I will stop there before I go off on yet another epic rant about lost media. Oh, I believe this one is kind of directed at you, Ashley. From Jane via our website. With regard to the episode Alice, the Have Gun Will Travel episode Alice, Jane says, good take as always. However, one of my first thoughts was who is the father, and Paladin was top on my list.
Whoa.
Okay, I'm starting to feel like this may be one of those instances where, did I not start wondering about this like everyone else did? Because I'm a guy, and it, would be like, oh, well, let's not talk about that. It's like, okay, I don't subscribe to the bro code or anything like that. I would like to think that's not it. But at the same time, and now I'm starting to feel kind of silly that I did not think of who's the father for Alice until we were recording the episode of the podcast, and then you just completely mentally derailed me in the wrap-up with that question.
Oh, sorry about the mental derailment, but yeah, I don't know. It does take two to tango, so I suppose we'll never know. This is where we go to AO3. We look for the Have Gun Will Travel fan fiction and see if anybody has followed up on this idea.
Surely it exists, and it's not just filled with Have Gun Will Travel Mr. Ed crossover fanfic.
Man, I would really like to read Have Gun Will Travel Mr. Ed crossover.
How great would that be? Just be wandering along in the desert, running from that corrupt sheriff in, what was that, El Paso stage?
Oh, yeah, El Paso stage, yeah.
Yeah, under the blazing noonday sun, and all of a sudden the horse is like, Paladin? I don't like how this is shaping up, Paladin.
It's pretty good Mr. Ed, my friend.
I have a Mr. Ed story that is absolutely not fit for air on this podcast.
Okay, fair enough.
This is where I remind people, get in the van, we've got candy, that you get to hear if you join the Mission Log Patreon at patreon.com/missionlog.
All right, are we ready for our next letter?
Yes, the envelope, please.
The envelope, please. So we got this via YouTube from M. Gale P. Regarding our episode about Les Girls. Sometimes the mail order bride system was more the equivalent of a modern dating app rather than trafficking. In New Orleans, the Ursuline nuns were in charge of the mail order brides until they married. Most of the ladies came because they believed it would be better here than the poverty they came from. The only way it is not icky is when there is a period of letters or system like Living with the Nuns that allows the couple to get to know each other first. FYI, the brides were called casket girls because they came with a small trunk called a cassette in French. Wow. So thank you for that feedback, M. Gail P. I did not know that about the mail-order bride system.
Okay, did their trunk contain, like, a dowry?
I don't know.
Not to be opened, do not open until Christmas or whatever the day is.
I minored in Spanish, so I didn't know a small trunk in French was called a cassette. So now I'm like, is it filled with cassette tapes or video cassettes?
Just mixtapes. Mixtapes.
I was like, maybe that's where all of these lost episodes are. They're stuck in somebody's cassette.
That's interesting. I know that we were kind of looking at that from a perhaps almost too much of a modern standpoint.
Sure.
Because there is a lot of chatter now in the news about trafficking and exploitation. And so it's kind of hard not to go into that. It's kind of hard to go into that episode and not be carrying that baggage. We're carrying our own small trunks with us, each of us.
Our own cassettes.
Yes. And so I will, I will cop to that perhaps we carried a little too much modern baggage with us into our analysis of that episode. But surely there's still a better system. And yet, I don't know what it is.
Yeah. No, but that's really interesting, and I appreciate that historical context. That's definitely a better system than, what we were thinking that it might have been. So,
yeah. Full disclosure, speaking really only for myself here, we're seldom going to have the full historical context for something. Because kind of what we are doing if something like this comes up is that we go looking for enough information to give it that context and maybe invite the listener to do some further reading, listening, whatever, and fill in those blanks. Y'all are getting to listen to us educate ourselves in real time. That's kind of cool, but we, may occasionally miss a thing or two. But that's kind of part of the fun, is that would I have ever looked into the historical implications of the mail-order bride system and its heyday if it hadn't come up in this episode of Have Gun Will Travel? Probably not. It wasn't on my bingo card for this year. Oh, hey, I need to learn more about mail-order brides.
Right.
A few things may slip through the cracks from time to time, and hopefully not something that's big enough that, we're actually approaching something completely wrong. But it's kind of fun that we're getting to educate ourselves here. Other people have other pieces of the puzzle, and maybe we all get to learn something. That would be cool. That is cool. This is a great gig.
It really is. I was describing what I was doing at Gene-ology to a friend on Sunday night, and he was like, you're actually getting to do, a lot of, kind of first-hand research on this stuff. I was like, yeah, I kind of am. That's pretty cool. He's like, that's really cool. And I'm like, yeah, there are definitely worse ways to spend my time. So,
yeah.
But, yeah, this is good fun, because we get to hang out, and that's fun. But we get to talk about this interesting bit of media from this particular perspective of Gene's writing. So, yeah, I don't think that would have come up in my Google searches either, and you got to be careful how you word it, because you don't want to end up on some sort of list. So, but I really appreciate that feedback from M. Gail P. So thank you, M. Gail P.
Yeah, and when it comes to that topic, you definitely don't want to the list you don't want to wind up on is Craigslist.
Right. All right, Earl, are you ready for the next one?
Yes, we have one here from Alan. This was one of our Facebook comments on the Prussian farmer. Alan said, I was curious about the historical context, so I decided to look up the Austro-Prussian War. It took place in 1866 and did, in fact, concern the territories of Schleswig and Holstein, which the two powers had taken from Denmark together in a previous war. Ultimately, Prussia won their war and took control of both of those areas. Today they're known as Schleswig-Holstein and are the northernmost state in Germany. Also, we know Gene was a Sam Houston aficionado, But do we know if he was up on Revolutionary War figures as well? There's something about Mueller, and Alan, correct us on our pronunciation. I was saying Mueller, and I probably got us started on that. Alan says it would typically be Mueller. And I should point out that in the scene, John and Bonnie got that correct as well. So the wrong pronunciation, that would be me over here.
All good. I didn't study German, so I had no idea.
Alan says there's something about Mueller here that reminds me of General Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the Prussian baron who helped train the Continental Army. Von Steuben apparently also fought in the Austro-Prussian War, and both men seem to be admired for their military discipline and tactical thinking. Alexander Hamilton actually helped translate and implement von Steuben's training methods, which overall helped turn the American army into a more efficient and competent force. And yet, he's one of the few revolutionaries who somehow got left out of the musical. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story, indeed. Okay, I'm color me fascinated there. I had never heard of the guy.
I didn't either, so I guess we're telling his story.
Alan's telling his story.
Yeah,
I'm just sitting here reading Alan's letter.
Reading it out loud. Good job, Alan.
Yeah. Okay, Alan goes on, sorry for the digression. It's just that growing up around Chicago, you get the sense that revolutionary figures like von Steuben, and especially Casimir Pulaski, are way bigger deals than they get credit for elsewhere. The parade in Ferris Bueller, for example, is the von Steuben Day Parade, and it's a real event. But back to Boots and Saddles. Thanks for another fascinating discussion on this little-known show. Sadly, it does seem to be more a product of its time compared to Have Gun Will Travel. It is really disappointing to hear that the native people are treated as little more than savage villains here. The suggestion that the canon would be dangerous if they figure out how to use it is pretty terrible. The casual joking about spousal abuse is also unfortunate. Alan added on Discord, I'm really grateful to you all for bringing these shows to our attention. I think my favorites have been the episodes that defied my expectations in some way. Take Monster of Moon Ridge, for example. I can't think of anything like that on any other Western. Is there any episode that has left you feeling similarly surprised? And go.
I say there's a lot to unpack in all of that. So first of all, Alan, thanks for that feedback. I think the one that really caught me by surprise the most was the Monster of Moon Ridge. Just because that felt so much like a Scooby-Doo episode that I never would have thought it was a Western.
Yeah, there have been many episodes of Have Gun that have gone in directions I wasn't expecting. And kind of getting to that last part of Alan's note, I think what we're seeing with Boots and Saddles not living up to the standards of Have Gun Will Travel, I think that is perhaps the difference between most of the Westerns that were on the air and Have Gun Will Travel. I think you had showrunners and a stable of writers who kept coming back, like Gene, who were much more liberal in their outlook and were figuring out, kind of subversively, honestly, how to insert that into a Western, which is possibly the genre of storytelling that is almost least favorable to a more liberal worldview. Because Westerns, by their very nature, so often deal with shoot from the hip, summary justice. You got out of line, so now there are bullets heading your way. That's not a great place to talk about social justice or gender politics or anything like that, or acceptance and tolerance and diversity. And yet Gene has stuck all of these themes into his scripts. So I really think the difference between Boots and Saddles and Have Gun Will Travel, which on the one hand, I kind of feel almost like I owe our listeners an apology for the dash of cold water in the face that Boots and Saddles has been because it is not something that is letting Gene kind of get to throw the whole Gene into his scripts. But I think it is a useful contrast to show us this is pretty much the standard of what else was on the air. And this is why Have Gun Will Travel was so different and so special. And so I really think there is a reason that, whereas I am making shady deals online with film collectors to acquire DVDRs of Boots and Saddles, that for all we know are like the only 6 or 7 episodes that still exist, versus Have Gun Will Travel it's on streaming services. You can go watch it right now. I think the fact that it is such a standout in its social messaging is part of why it is still around. Because it was not a Western that was cut from the same cloth. As far as narrowing it down to a single episode, Monster of Moon Ridge is a good one. I mean, that's a very good example. I think Charlie Red Dog is an outstanding example of something that went into directions I didn't expect. Episode in Laredo, talks so much about how there's going to be 2 guys going to stand out in the street and draw guns on each other. And yet it studiously spends the whole 26 minutes not drawing guns on each other and trying to talk it out instead. Absolutely not what you expected when you tuned in for your Western that week, that most people probably assumed would be both rooting and tooting, but not talking about ethical issues.
Yeah, when you tune into a Western from the 50s, you're expecting a shoot 'em up, not a, hey, let's talk it out.
Yeah, and so has there been any episode that has left me feeling surprised? On Have Gun Will Travel, Alan? Yeah, most of them. Name one. There have been a couple that have been not Gene's greatest work for whatever reason. Maybe he was having an off week. Maybe he had stacked up way too many gigs that he had to turn in scripts for and just couldn't give that week's script the TLC that it needed to make it an all-time classic. But most of his stuff for Have Gun Will Travel, you can see why they kept inviting him back so much, to the point that he is tied with one other writer as having turned in the most scripts for that show. More or less approximately 1/10 of the show was written by Gene. I think there's a reason for that.
Definitely not insubstantial when you consider that the show ran 6 seasons.
It's really uncommon for anyone other than the show's creators, or perhaps its present showrunners, if that is a different person, to have that much control over what the show is and what it's becoming. Yeah, they obviously had in mind a particular kind of writer and a particular kind of story they wanted told on this show. Sam Rolfe did, and Herb Meadow, the other creator of Have Gun Will Travel, and the various producers that followed them down through the years. And Gene was as close to their platonic ideal of what they wanted happening with this show as you could get, because he was there for an awful lot of it. We have one last email here. This is another one from M. Gale P. on YouTube regarding the episode Juliet. I agree it is ick to pair a 40-year-old and a 17-year-old, but your comment at 49 minutes that no one should be paired with someone with a job violent enough they may not come home is a bit of a disservice to all military spouses. While not an ideal situation, sometimes it is just a fact. Okay, that's a good point, and while I was reading that, it also occurred to me, spouses of first responders.
Yeah, that occurred to me too when I read over that as well, So,
okay, I will fess up, maybe that was slightly insensitive on my part. I still think for some people it's going to be a factor, though. And in fact, it's been the subject itself of many a television drama down through the years of there being kind of a mismatch in expectations between someone working in a dangerous field and someone who sits at home at night wondering if that person's going to come home. So, could I have found a better way to phrase that? Quite possibly. There's a lot of things I've said in real time in my life that I could have found a better way to phrase, and I do still try to work on that a lot. I am standing fast on the fact that it would be a big factor for some people.
Yeah, that's a challenging position to be in, and I certainly don't envy anyone who has a spouse in a high-risk job. God bless you guys for taking on that kind of risk, so other folks don't have to. Because that's definitely a calling that I don't know that I have. So I'm glad some folks feel called to that sort of thing for the benefit of other folks. So thank you. But yeah, that's not a perspective I'd really thought about either. Because it's one thing if it's a military or a first responder. I think with Paladin, it's neither. He's not military.
He's ex-military.
Yeah, that's true. He is ex-military. Yeah, I don't want to be insensitive to folks who have spouses that perform those kinds of high-risk jobs.
Absolutely not. And so I will cop to perhaps a bit of Captain America would say phrasing there. I still think that it is... it's a consideration for some people, and I think the fact that it has itself become a story that other writers have told in other media points to that as well. But definitely appreciate those who do take the risk. We've had this conversation many times on the show. Does Paladin have to take those risks, or does he just want to? Is he... And maybe because he wants to, maybe that's incorrectly phrased. Maybe with his particular skill set, it's what he knows how to do. I know that Norman frequently brings up the speech in First Blood, the first Rambo movie. He used to operate military gunships that cost millions of dollars. And then he comes home as a veteran from an unpopular war and can't get a job parking cars. Is Paladin in that situation? I guess that kind of becomes the question.
It is a good question.
I don't think it's one that the show answers. I'll put it that way.
No.
The show needs Paladin to be doing this high-risk thing week after week, or else it's not exciting and doesn't meet the basic contour outlines of a primetime Western. So... yeah, as far as the show is concerned, it's kind of like, we do not talk of these things.
Yeah, it's not something that it's discussing explicitly.
Yeah, it would be interesting. I know in the Discord there's been a conversation of why has this show not ever had a modern reboot, where some of this stuff could have been aired out a bit more, gotten a bit more story development. Apparently, at one point, there were hints that someone had the rights, and they were going to do something with them. I believe this was in the 90s. That didn't happen. I would point to the movie we did get of the Wild Wild West and say, thank goodness that didn't happen. Because the thing about Have Gun Will Travel is that in its own way, kind of like the Twilight Zone went to 1-hour episodes for one season. And they weren't, it's kind of acknowledged by everyone, including Rod Serling. That was not his favorite season because he felt that the show had an ideal length and 1 hour was not it. These episodes that Gene has been writing of Have Gun Will Travel, they're like zip files.
Yeah.
They contain multitudes, to go all Walt Whitman on it. And yet they're only 26 minutes long. In a few cases, we have found ourselves asking, okay, could this have been developed better? And yet, if the story lives on in someone's imagination, maybe that is the hallmark that it was a good story. I would never make it a criticism, this should have been an hour, or this should have been a two-parter, which I think there was only one two-parter in the entire history of Have Gun. That two-parter was not something written by Gene. Most of these stories are playing out with exactly the amount of detail that is needed. And the rest of it really is kind of in the live in your imagination department. So put me in the glad there has not been a reboot or remake camp, because it would almost certainly be an hour long, and I feel like it would lose something. Do we need that when the originals are this good? It's like, someone please just rescan that stuff at HD.
Yeah.
Freshen up your streaming files, put Blu-rays out there. I personally would be very happy with that. We appreciate everyone who has left comments on YouTube, sent us emails, left comments on Facebook. We love it. We love it. First off, that lets us know you're listening, and that's awesome. Nothing is worse than putting a podcast out there and hearing nothing but the sound of crickets and, nothing but the great scent of pine, because no one is out there but the trees. So the feedback is wonderful and it's valuable, and we love knowing that you like the show. And here's the thing. We didn't really cherry pick comments and emails here to be favorable. The feedback we have gotten has almost universally been positive. So it's great to know that you're listening. Please keep listening. Please tell other people you're listening if you feel like doing that. And that ensures the podcast has a life as long as Gene's writing career.
Thanks, guys, for jumping in and sending us some feedback. This has been wonderful. Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, please drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
We'll be back next week with more Gene-ology. Stay tuned. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Rand Hurl, Tom Kozak, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
Back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.